next thing we want to be able to do is apply that unit circle quiz to individual questions. Do you not have this notepad? Okay. So in your mind, this is sort of how to do this with mental math. You've got your unit circle memorized, but usually people have quadrant 1 memorized the best. And then you use quadrant 1 to figure everything else out. We do the same thing when we try to figure out these questions. We first of all recognize that, okay, if I want to find sine of 7 pi over 6, it's pretty easy for me to recognize that that's part of my pi over 6 family. I know that sine of pi over 6 is a half, so that means sine of 7 pi over 6 will also be a half, but I don't know if it's positive or negative. So you're going to figure out reference angle, and you're also going to think, where is 7 pi over 6? It's in quadrant 3. And according to my cast rule, sine is negative in quadrant 3. So from that, I'm able to write that this is equal to negative a half. My quadrant tells me it's negative. My reference angle tells me that it's a half. So, tan of 2 pi over 3. My reference angle is pi over 3. I know that tan of pi over 3 is root 3. Quadrant, it's in quadrant 2. I know tan is negative in quadrant 2, so then I would get negative root 3. That's the process that we want to do for our mental math. We want to think what quadrant it's in, what's its reference angle, and then really have our quadrant 1 memorized well so that we can just go, oh, it's going to be negative root 3. Try this one first in your head, and then if you have a circle beside you that you've worked out, you could check the answer after. If you wrote root 2 over 2, or both of those would be, they mean the same thing. One of them just has the denominator rationalized. But it's good to recognize them both, because sometimes you'll get questions that the 1 over root 2 shows up, sometimes the root 2 over 2. So knowing that both of those are the same thing can be helpful. Then if you get to questions with secant, cosecant, and cotangent, what you're going to do is you're going to first solve the one that's related. And remember, angles never change. Ratios change, angles never change. So if I wanted to figure out cos of negative pi over 4, I would know that it's in quadrant 4, that its reference angle is the pi over 4 family, and I know that cos of negative pi over 4 then is positive root 2 over 2. Or, again, 1 over root 2. If I know cos, then secant is just the ratio gets split because it's a reciprocal. So if I know cos is root 2 over 2, I can write secant is 2 over root 2. Can you see in this one it's actually nicer if you use the 1 over root 2? Because when you flip it, root 2 over 1, or just root 2, is a nicer answer than 2 over root 2. So just recognizing those kind of things can sometimes be helpful. Cotangent, negative 11 pi over 6. So we would think about tangent of negative 11 pi over 6. We would recognize that a reference angle is pi over 6. Now, for thinking of the quadrant, I sometimes find this helpful. So here's a circle that you're looking at. You know that 11 pi over 6 is one of your pi over 6 families in quadrant 4, right? If I was going in the positive direction, 11 pi over 6 is in quadrant 4. Does it make sense now, thinking in the negative direction, if I moved 4 quadrants in the negative direction, I would end in quadrant 1. So if we can think about 11 pi over 6 as being in quadrant 4, negative 11 pi over 6 is going 4 quadrants in the negative direction, would end in quadrant 1. Now, pi over 6 family is root 3 over 3. I don't know if you use that strategy where 3 plus 3 equals 6 to remember the pi over 6 for tan. It's also equal to 1 over root 3, so when you're writing cotangent, you could either write your answer like this or like this. If you have your axes family, right, pi over 2 is part of your axes family. I think the axes family is easiest just to think about where is negative pi over 2. That's where negative pi over 2 is. We are looking for sine. Sine is the y coordinate. So if you have your axes family, just think about the points that are on your axes. Sine would be negative 1, so cosecant would be 1 over negative 1, which is still just negative 1. And then the most typical questions that come out of this on tests, they're usually 3 or 4 mark questions, look like a combination of what we just did. What we just did was individual questions. Can you figure out this? Can you figure out this? Can you figure out this? They get combined. So we have to think about our unit circle, coterminal angles, everything combined, reciprocals to figure out this question. What we're going to do, and the work that you're going to show, I'm going to sort of separate the page here. I'm going to color code things. I'm going to figure out secant. I'm going to do that in blue. All my work for that in blue. I'm going to figure out cos. I'm going to do that in green. And I'm going to figure out tan. I'm going to do that in purple. Because basically what we have in a question like this is we have 3 individual trig things from our pie plate we have to figure out. Put in those numbers, and then after that, you just have to simplify fractions. So starting with the blue, if I want to find secant of 11 pi over 3, I need to first find cos of 11 pi over 3. I know that that's part of my pi over 3 family. I would take the 11 pi over 3, change it to a mixed fraction, 3 2/3, and that tells me what quadrant it's in. What quadrant would 3 2/3 be? Right? The 3, right, tells me it's on the negative x-axis. The 2/3 means I go more than half. It has to be in quadrant 4. So now, if I have my pi over 3 family, Quadrant 4 cos is positive. Cos of 11 pi over 3 would be 1 over 2. Then in the blue brackets, I can now replace secant with 11 pi over 3 with 2 over 1. This is my thinking off to the side, just to fill in that number. Now I'm going to go to green for cos of negative 5 pi over 4. I know it's part of my pi over 4 family. What quadrant is negative 5 pi over 4? Again, I would say I see 5 pi over 4 on my pi plate is in quadrant 3, in the positive direction. So if I wanted to go negative 5 pi over 4, I'd have to go 3 quadrants in the negative direction. Do you see that that would end in quadrant 2? Cos is negative in quadrant 2. Pi over 4 family is always root 2 over 2. So I can now determine that this would be negative root 2 over 2. Finally, purple, tan of 23 pi over 6. I notice it's part of the pi over 6 family. 23 pi over 6 is 3 and 5/6 pi. That 3 and 5/6, same thing here. 3 would be here, 5/6 is more than half. Tells me it's in quadrant 4. This will be negative, and the pi over 6 family is root 3 over 3. So I now can fill in negative root 3 over 2. Finally, we have to simplify. We have to know how do we multiply fractions. Multiply the numerators, multiply the denominator. Maybe you notice that this 2 will simplify with that 2 and just become 1 over 1. We also have to remember, how do we multiply square roots together, right? A negative times a negative, this will be positive. Square root of 2 times square root of 3 is square root of 6. On the bottom, I have 1 times 1 times 3. When a question asks for an exact value, it means it's a non-calculator question and you'd leave your answers with square roots. As soon as we type this into our calculator, we'd have to round it and then you no longer have an exact answer. So exact answers always include things like pi, include square roots, things that you wouldn't simplify or wouldn't round when you put them into your calculator. Okay, now, these questions are super important, and I have a worksheet of these for you. This worksheet has 4 parts. And we are going to take 10 minutes, but we're going to start on part 3. Okay? You're going to do part 3, then you're going to do part 4.